friends, welcome back to my channel. I'm Haley, and today I'm going to talk about all the books that I read in the month of February. And I am naming this Februween because totally unplanned, but most of the books I read ended up being horror books or at least supernatural type books. Not all, there's a few exceptions. But that made me think that from now on, I'm always going to celebrate Februween in the month of February, and I'm going to read horror books or supernatural books or whatever, because I have two main reasons for this. For one, it is 4 months after Halloween is over, so if you binge a bunch of horror books in October and are kind of tired of horror by the end of the month, then 4 months later is a really good time to get back into it. My second reason is because, of course, we have Valentine's Day in February, and what better way is there to celebrate love than by reading scary things? There is no better way. The first book was called Betwixt by Darynda Jones. And I don't have a lot to say about this book. It was kind of a supernatural rom-com kind of book. It was a lot of fun. It wasn't very serious or deep. It was about a woman who finds out she's a witch, and not only a witch, but like a super powerful witch. And she's in danger because of her powers. It was not a very original story, but you know, it was humorous, it was fun. Yeah, I didn't rate it because I didn't feel like it was the kind of book that you really need to rate because it's just pure fun. Yeah. So the next book I read is this book called Luster by Leilani. I loved this book. I bought this hard copy at a used bookstore, and I didn't annotate it, but I did tab it. I didn't annotate it because I wasn't sure if I was going to keep the book when I first started it, and I didn't want to write it a bunch and then give it to someone else. So I just annotated it with tabs. The tabs are not color coded this time. They're just things that I enjoyed. I just put a tab on it instead of underlining, basically. Yeah, so this book is about a woman named Edie. She is a Black woman. She has a career she finds pretty unfulfilling. She works for a publisher in the children's book section, so she kind of has contact with these children's book authors. What she really wants to do is switch over to the illustration side of things, but every time she's tried to do that, she's been told her art isn't good enough and that she needs to keep practicing and working on it. So she, you know, goes through a lot of rejection there. The central relationship, I guess, in this book is between Edie and Eric. Eric is a white man. He's a lot older than Edie. Edie's in her early 20s. Eric, I think he's in his 40s, and he's in an open marriage with rules. But he very quickly starts breaking the rules of his open marriage with Edie. His wife is named Rebecca, and at one point, Eric stops contacting Edie, and Edie's in really deep by this point, and she doesn't like being ignored, so she shows up at his house, and Eric isn't there, but Rebecca is there, his wife. And Rebecca knows immediately who she is and invites her to stay for a party they're having at their house that night, which is such a bizarre choice, but she does. And it turns out to be Eric and Rebecca's anniversary party, and Eric doesn't realize Edie is there for the longest time, and it's super awkward. As you can imagine it would be. Now, while Edie is there, she meets Akila, and Akila is Eric and Rebecca's adopted daughter, and Akila is also Black. And Akila makes the comment to Edie that she's the first Black person that Akila's seen in the neighborhood, something along those lines. Edie ends up losing her job, and Rebecca asks Edie to move in with her and Eric. Again, such a bizarre thing. And even more bizarre is that Edie agrees. She moves in with this couple who are married, and she's the other woman. And Rebecca asks her to stop seeing Eric. And she also becomes kind of a mentor figure for Akila as really the only other Black person in Akila's life. We find out that Akila had been in foster care and had only recently been adopted by Eric and Rebecca, with like maybe a couple years before the start of the novel. So that's all I'm gonna say. I think it sounds like I gave away like a huge part of the plot, but I really didn't. There's so much to this book. It was so good. So bizarre. I felt so weird about the choices Edie made. She's very self-destructive. She seems to be having some kind of mental health issues. And she doesn't really seem to care about what happens to her. That's Ziva, sorry. So it's difficult a little bit sometimes reading from her perspective, because you're like, stop, why are you doing that? Stop that. But it was a really, really good book, and the writing is really good in here. I really enjoy this author's writing style. I believe this is her debut novel. Yes, this is her debut novel. So I'm really excited to see what Raven Leilani comes out with next. The next book I read, it was another audiobook that I listened to, and that was My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry by Fredrick Backman. Same author who wrote A Man Called Uva. Now, A Man Called Uva was one of my favorite books, and so I had pretty high expectations about this one, and I didn't like it as much, which surprises me, because the narrator of this book is a little girl, an 8-year-old girl, seven-year-old girl. And I usually love books written from the perspective of kids, but I don't know what it was I didn't love about this one. But I don't know. It was okay. It was a good entertaining read. But I didn't like it as much as I liked A Man Called Uva. So this book is about Elsa. She's a 7-year-old. She doesn't fit in at school. She doesn't have any friends. Her only friend is her grandmother, and her grandmother passes away from cancer at the very close to the beginning of the story. And this grandmother has these letters that she wants Elsa to deliver, that are basically apologizing for different things. And as Elsa goes along finding these people for her grandmother, she sort of makes friends along the way. And there's a dog in the book, which is a great character. Any dog is always a good character. Woman Eating by Kohda is the next book that I read, and I really loved this book. I don't remember how I got the recommendation. I'm sure it was somewhere on YouTube. And it was described to me as a literary vampire novel, so of course I had to read it. And yeah, that's exactly what it was. So the story follows Lydia. She goes by Lyd. She is in her early 20s, and she's a vampire. She was turned into a vampire as a baby by her mother, who is also a vampire. And so she doesn't remember anything except for being a vampire. Whereas in the world, most people are turned into vampires as adults. But she grew up, and she was able to age normally throughout her childhood. And it was only once she hit like 18 that she stopped aging. So she had, normal growth. But she was always a vampire. She could only drink blood, and she couldn't go out in the sun too long. It's not in this book. It's like they would just get like a sunburn, basically worse than other people would. It's not like she like dies if she goes in the sun. She just gets a sunburn. So her mother, the character of her mother, is very interesting because she started losing her memory, and so Lyd has put her in a nursing home, and Lyd has moved away from her mom for the very first time, and has moved into like an artist's studio colony thing. And she's a visual artist, she's a painter, and she was also a performance artist in college. And she wants to continue to pursue art. So she gets this internship that's somewhat prestigious, but that she's pretty immediately disappointed by, because the internship isn't what she thought it would be, and it isn't going to get her where she thought it would. She makes friends, and she had a childhood friend that she grew up with, but she's had to kind of cut off this friend because the friend is eventually going to notice that she's not aging. So she, has already cut her off, even though she doesn't really want to. So she's made these new friends, and there's a scene where they have dinner together, and she wants to become human. She wants to like totally push aside her vampire self and wants to become human and learn how to eat like normal food. It was such a good book. And if you're expecting like a traditional vampire story full of lots of blood and guts and hauntings and action. This is not the book for you. There's really not very much action in it. It's mostly about this character and her attempts to become more human. And she's such an interesting character because she does feel very human, even as she realizes she's not. Like, even as she is realizing how much separation there is between her and the actual humans, she feels so very human. And I really enjoyed the book. The next book I read, this was an audiobook. I feel like I'm alternating between ebooks and audiobooks because it's like I'm always listening to an audiobook and reading an ebook usually at the same time. So anyway, yeah, it was an audiobook, Such Sharp Teeth by Rachel Harrison. And this book I've seen a lot on BookTube and on Book Talk and Instagram. More so back in Halloween, but I'm finally getting to read it now. And it is about a werewolf, which was very interesting. I don't think I've read a book about a werewolf since Twilight, and I read Twilight a very long time ago. So I really like the idea of of werewolf characters and exploring, what does it really mean to be a werewolf. And I would love to read a book that's exactly like Woman Eating, but that has like a werewolf character instead of a vampire character. Anyway, so this book was about, what's her name? Rory. Okay. So Rory is a young woman who has returned back to her childhood home because her twin sister Scarlett is pregnant and is going to give birth soon, and she asked for Rory to come back to kind of support her because her boyfriend left. So Rory goes to stay with her sister. She meets her childhood friend Ian, who's a guy that always had a crush on her and is always in love with her. And for the first time, she might have some feelings back. And then she's bitten by a werewolf and turns into a werewolf. And that's pretty much the setup of the story. I didn't really love this book. I have several reasons why I didn't love it. First of all, it was classified as horror, and it's really not horror. I mean, I would say that it's like a supernatural rom-com, kind of like Betwixt was, and which is fine. I will obviously happily read supernatural rom-coms, but not when I'm going in thinking horror. And it read like a romance book. The tone was that same sort of light tone that are in romance books, which again, I enjoy sometimes. Not my absolute favorite genre, but every now and then I'll read one. And I probably would have read this book as a romance novel and enjoyed it, but I didn't enjoy it being horror. And another thing I really did not like about this book is, I don't want to spoil it, but really I think people need to know this part of it going into it because it could be very triggering. So there is an experience that Rory had at 11 years old of childhood sexual abuse, and that has kind of informed her character up until this point. We see that is why she is unwilling and unable to have meaningful relationships with men, and that's why she's kind of secluded herself from her family, because she does have a lot of anger toward her mom for basically allowing it to happen. And what I didn't like was there was not really a resolution of that. There's very understandable parts of her personality that are coping skills that are, from this childhood event, and she just gets over it, I guess, kind of. I mean, again, I'm not trying to spoil anything, but she just kind of gets over it in a way that doesn't feel honest to anyone who has, had those sorts of experiences in the past. She doesn't go to therapy. There's no real reason why she would just get over it, but she does. And I didn't like that. I feel like it was, used just as like a character trait for her and something to make the backstory seem more interesting. And I felt like it wasn't handled very well in the book. So I think if you're going to include something like that, you have to be really careful in how that character resolves that trauma or doesn't resolve that trauma. You don't even have to resolve it, but just sort of like forgetting about it and moving on for no reason is not realistic. And I didn't think that was handled very well. So I didn't really like the book, and I don't know if I would read any more books from her. I haven't read Cackle. That's the one that I feel like everybody's read. But I don't know that I would read anything by her again unless it gets just super amazing reviews. Okay, this next book has already become one of my favorite books of all time, and that is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. I'm obsessed with this book. However, if you have seen the British cover, I'll put it on the screen. It's so pretty, and this one is not. I bought this hard copy. I hardly ever buy hard copies of books, and all the books you see behind me are basically books I had for school or bought at a used bookstore back when I was buying a lot more books than I am now. But this book was so good. I had to buy it. But the British cover is vastly superior, and if I ever find a copy with the British cover, I'm going to buy it. Hands down. Point blank. Anyway, this book. All right. So this book is about Miri and Leah. Now, Leah is a diver. She goes down in submarines and explores the ocean. And her wife is Miri. And before the start of the book, Leah went on an expedition that was supposed to be a 3-week-long expedition. And it ended up being 6 months long. And Miri eventually got to the point where she decided that Leah must be dead. She's not coming back because the submarine was lost and there was no information about what actually happened to Leah. But she does come back, and that happens before the start of the novel. But we do get flashbacks. So every other chapter is from Leah's perspective and what is actually happening in the submarine. And then sort of in the present, we have Miri dealing with Leah's return, because Leah has come back not the same person. She's become a very different person, and really odd things are happening to her. She's bleeding a lot from, she has and they explain it in the book as her skin has become so used to the pressure under the sea that it is no longer able to hold her blood in. So she'll just seep blood from her skin. She's always bleeding from the gums, and all she wants to do is sit in the bathroom, in the bathtub, and listen to her sound machine of the ocean. And that's basically all she does, is she does that, and then she talks about the ocean. And Miri has no idea how to get through to this person that has returned. She's so different. She doesn't even seem to... She has the same memories as Miri does, but they don't seem significant to Leah anymore. And the book is, it's classified as a literary horror book, which I've figured out is basically my sweet spot. Any sort of literary but horror, or literary but speculative, kind of like Woman Eating was about vampires. That is what I really, really like from a book. So this book, actually, okay, I'm not going to talk that much about it because I'm going to make an entire video just on this book, or I might include some examples from other books, but basically talk about why it's so scary, even when nothing horrifying necessarily happens in the book, but the whole thing, you just feel so on edge and scared. And but also enjoying this wonderful relationship between these two women. Miri has a lot of flashbacks to when she and Leah were married, but before Leah went on this expedition and changed. So we really get to see what their relationship used to be like and compare it to what it's like now in the present. And it was just so well done, so well written. I love the relationship between the characters. I feel like it could be an allegory for so many different things. One thing that really seemed to be strong to me in this book was this idea of it being an allegory for PTSD, because Leah left, she went away, she had some sort of traumatic experience, and she's come back very changed. She can no longer connect with her partner, and she's unable to explain why to her partner, and she's unable to explain what she experienced. And I just thought that related a lot to PTSD. So again, I'm going to make a whole video just on this book, so I'm not going to talk too much more about it, but I am obsessed with this book. I don't think it's for everybody because it is a very slow book, and if you're going into it looking for like a horror book that's going to like scare you, this one's not really going to do it. It is pretty gory. Like, there's a lot of body horror with Leah and her bleeding mouth and sort of the transformation of her. But there's nothing really scary. So don't read it if you're just looking for a scare. But if you want to read a really interesting relationship between two people that also is just sort of fills you with existential dread and you don't really know why, this is the book for you. So the second to last book I read was The Last Housewife by Ashley Winstead. And I have read one of her other books, In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife. I read that one pretty recently, and I just read this one. This I read as an ebook. And this book is about a woman named Shay. She's a housewife, as the title suggests. Her husband is extremely wealthy, and she has just quit her job and is staying home to work on her writing, full-time, basically. And at the beginning of the novel, her husband is away on business, and she starts listening to a podcast by a man named Jamie. And Jamie's actually her childhood friend who she's no longer in contact with. So she's listening to this podcast, and Jamie is talking about a suicide that he suspects might be a murder of a woman named Laurel. Now, she realizes that Laurel is her friend from college, and that these two and their other third friend, whose name is Clementine, they went through some sort of traumatic experience together, although we don't know what it is at the beginning. And Clementine goes by Clem. Clem actually committed suicide when they were in college. And now Laurel has committed suicide in a seemingly very similar way. And Jamie is investigating it because he's not sure that it was a suicide. He thinks it might have been a murder. So Shay meets up with Jamie, and they agree to investigate, try to figure out what happened to Laurel. And we find out, so this book is actually pretty dark and pretty graphic. It turns out she gets involved, that Laurel's probably involved, or was probably involved in this sex cult. And it's not really a very fun sex cult. It's it's a lot about like men domineering over women. So it was actually very uncomfortable to read, and it was a good book, but I thought it went on a little too long. I feel like there was a lot that could have been cut out, and it wouldn't be much different. I did not really enjoy the super graphic sex cult stuff. It was pretty disturbing to me. So if you have any, I don't know, like, if that makes you uncomfortable, this probably is not the book for you. It made me very uncomfortable. But it was still good. I liked it, but I was really ready for it to be done because I was tired of reading about things that were kind of disturbing to me, which is weird because I just talked about how I found Our Wives Under the Sea disturbing, and I enjoyed that the feeling of being disturbed, but I didn't enjoy the feeling of being disturbed in The Last Housewife because it was a lot more, I don't know, it just made me feel icky. I don't want to spoil anything. So if you read it and you know like what's going on, and you probably understand what I mean when I say it feels icky, and if you read it, you'll understand what I mean when I say it made me feel icky. So I actually read one more thing in February, and it was a short story. It wasn't really a novel or, full book. It was The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. But I'm actually going to discuss that short story in my wrap up for next month, because I was rereading it because I was reading T. Kingfisher's What Moves the Dead, and I wanted to have it more fresh in my mind as to what happened in The Fall of the House of Usher. So I will talk about that next time, so I can talk about it in tandem with What Moves the Dead. Thank you so much for watching my wrap up. And let me know in the comments if you've read any of these, if you would like to read any of these. If you have any recommendations for me on literary horror or literary supernatural or literary speculative books, please drop them. I'm very interested. Thanks. Bye.